I've come to really hate that word gospel. I'm reading a great book at the moment about leadership in the church. The thing that bothers me about it really is just his liberal use of the word gospel. When you use a word like, well, any word actually, over and over again, you start to wonder whether it's got anything to it. If you say a word over and over and over, gospel, 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 eventually it just becomes sounds. It just becomes the movement of tongue, the pressure of air, the shape of the lips. It doesn't mean anything. When it's written down over and over and over again, and you hear it just ringing in your mind as you're reading through this book, as I have been, I have become increasingly agitated to the point that I'm starting to skip through the book. I just find it so frustrating, and it's got me kind of thinking about that. Why such a strong reaction to the word? Because it's definitely not because what I think he means by the word gospel, and when I use the word, and I've tended to shy away from it a bit, I like to use the word good news about Jesus Christ a bit more. Why am I so triggered by this word? And I'm triggered too when I hear people use it when they're preaching. It frustrates me, and I guess I've been spending the last couple of days wondering about that. What's getting under my skin here? Now, one way I suppose someone might challenge me to say, well, is it because it's the offence of the gospel? You know, there's a classic line out of Paul. People are going to be offended by the gospel. I don't think that's what this is. I'm not offended by what the gospel, what that word is meant to mean and what it's meant to point to. I'm frustrated more by the fact that we use the word and it no longer points there. And it might be that the person writing the book, and I'm absolutely sure that the person writing the book has intended to point that word in the right direction. And when I hear people preach, I think that's largely the case too. They're wanting to use this word as a sign pointing to a certain reality. The problem is that the word gospel has been used by so many different people in so many different ways, and it's been the word sitting in the mouth of people who have proven themselves to be betrayers of that it's become tarnished, and that's part of it. The other part of it is when we use the word, and in fact we discover that the word has an enormous reality to it, that it is pointing to a reality, to a kingdom, in fact, and to a king. We may not have the time or the mechanism when using that word to explore all of that it means, and so we use the word as a shorthand. But when you only ever use the shorthand, then it becomes a laziness, really, on the behalf of the writer or the preacher, and a way of getting out of trying to get to the nitty-gritty of what they meant when they were using that word. So let me put it this way. If I were to use the gospel and say, look, we want to be a gospel community. Let me say that as a example. I say this to the church. We want to be a gospel community. Okay. Now, probably everyone who's a Christian within that community will say, amen, that's what we want to be. But if I were to ask them each individually, what do you think that means? What will be evidence that we'll be a gospel community? Well, here's 3 examples of what I expect to get from a range of people within my own community. One will be, we're going to preach the gospel, meaning humans are sinners. Christ died for sin because the wages of sin are death. Christ, being the Son of God, took our place to protect us from the wrath of God, from the wages of sin being death, took our place on the cross, died, and rose again on the 3rd day to prove that the power of sin had been broken because death was now broken. And if we trusted in his name, we would be protected from death, we would be protected from the wages of sin, we'll be protected from the wrath of God, and we can ascend to heaven with Jesus when we die. That will be what some will think I mean when I say gospel community, that's what we'll be preaching day in, day out, week in, week out. And we'll be sending people out to proclaim that same message to everyone they meet, and their colleagues at work, people in school, Someone else might think, I know what you mean. You mean, like Jesus said, he said, others will know that you're my disciples by your love for one another. So when you talk about the gospel, you're talking about Jesus' command to his disciples to become a loving, committed community. And so when we become that, we will see good things happening. Others will hear it and say, yeah, it's like James said, the brother of Jesus, he wrote, pure religion that God affirms is love, care, compassion toward the distressed orphan and the distressed widow. It is, like a Salvation Army, active work to help those suffering in a wider community, not just within our own, but beyond our own borders as Christian communities. But that's what we'll do. That's what it means to be a gospel community. It'll be bringing the good news of Jesus Christ, who has come to heal and to save and to set free the prisoner, to release bondage, to declare the year of Jubilee, which means that those who have debts they can't pay have their debts wiped. It means those who lost land and are now in poverty will get their land back. So we'll be that to the community around us. We'll help people caught in poverty, we'll help them out of debt, etc. Now, all three of those has its place in that phrase, gospel of community, a gospel community. All three of those have its role in that idea. Because when we talk about gospel community, we're talking about an enormous thing, not a very small thing. We're talking about lots of elements to it. It is a tiny word, meaning a whole new reality is opened up that we can explore and live in and are to continue to walk in as life goes on. Because this word it's a tiny word pointing to, really just saying, the enemy has been defeated. We can now learn to live free in a new way. So when we use that word, we're saying, well, what does it mean to live free in a new way? Who was the enemy? And is the enemy still present in our lives? Do we need to be weary still of, being caught by an enemy? How do we live free? What is the free life? What is the good life? How do we live righteously? How do we live properly? How do we care for people who are struggling to do that? It's an enormous conversation. But the conversation ends, that's what it feels like to me anyway, when we just use that word gospel. It's like, that was the start of a conversation and it just ended when you use that word. So I feel like there's a laziness to it. A preacher should use that word and then say, and here's what I mean in this context. Because it's going to mean lots of things according to various issues in the world. The issue I'm looking at right now is this. And this is how, when I talk about the good news of Jesus Christ, this is how it gets applied to that situation. When we don't do that hard work, it's laziness. Because it is hard work. It's hard work to try and interpret the life of Christ in creative and expressive ways to the situations that we find in real life. Now, this was his real genius, his real brilliance. He talked about the gospel of Jesus Christ, of course he did. But what was brilliant about his letters is he took this, because of Christ and what he has done, now we can think about our sex lives like this. We can think about whether to marry or not like this. We can think about death like this. We can think about our resources, the money we have, the food we have, like this. We can think about our relationship to one another, whether and across racial grounds, like this. He looked at every issue in our human world and applied the revelation of Jesus Christ, what Christ revealed about what is real, and applied it to each situation with real creativity and real intelligence. And when we as preachers and writers fail to do that hard work, first of all understanding the issue properly, that requires work, and then understanding properly the story and life of Jesus to be able to apply what Jesus might ask of us in that particular situation. That too takes a lot of hard work. When we don't do that and we just say we're going to become a gospel community and not explain it, it's laziness. Or it might just be too hard. And that's why we need teachers. That's why we need apostles who I think have a real deep sense of what this world is that God has called us into. They are community creators, or at least they bring in the culture of God's kingdom and fight for it, and like Nehemiah when building the city, and he fought for something that he believed in, that he knew would be right, and he challenged the rich when they didn't, when they oppressed people. Building the city, and when he put people together into groups and units, he was doing it so not only would the city be protected, but in fact that they would in that time also create stronger units together and provide unity. He had a real vision for the kingdom of God that he used and applied in the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. That's what made him a remarkable leader in those times. But we also need prophets, people who somehow can see when things are going particularly awry and speak to that. And they'll often speak to the powers and the leaders of communities and challenging them about, well, when you do that, you realise you're having this effect, and you're not really serving the poor and the widows and the orphans. You're forgetting these ones who don't fit in. You're not making your kingdom wide enough to bring in people who don't normally fit in. We need prophets who can do that, and we need teachers, intelligent people who can apply in ways that even the simplest mind can understand. This is what it means to follow Christ. And when I say simplest, to do it in the simplest terms requires a real depth of understanding. C.S. Lewis was able to write in simple terms because he was such a brilliant mind. And we may not all be that. We're not all that. We're not all C.S. Lewis, but we can quote him, and we can use him, and we can use Paul, and we have all of these examples of wonderful teaching that we're to grapple with and then find our own ways of applying as faithfully as we can in the situations we're in. So I guess that's probably what I've really found myself frustrated with when we use that word gospel, is it feels like it's sort of a narrowing down and a flattening of the big reality that the word speaks to and points to, and also a sign of laziness, that instead of working hard to define the problem that we are trying to grapple with, and also therefore trying to describe how we think God's goodness calls us to act differently in those situations. When we don't do that and we just throw in the word gospel, it's laziness, and it doesn't help anyone. It's not moving anyone forward, because when we really describe things that really matter, when we say we have failed in these specific ways, and the good news of Jesus Christ, the gospel of Jesus Christ, calls us to respond in these specific ways, then we know we're really hearing it, because we will be provoked, we will be stirred, we will be comforted in some way, because we'll be like, yeah, you're right, I know that we've done that, and now seeing that we have a chance to make it right. And I think that's a particular form of suffering that's unspoken within the churches at the moment, is that in preachers' inability to really name specific sins, because it's a real awkward thing to do, by the way, we're also not allowing people to own it by seeing it, by hearing it and recognizing the truth of what's been said. We are trapped in our unknowing, even if we feel that there's something wrong. So when someone says it, it may be an awkward conversation, but there's also a sense of healing and relief in being in something like a secret coming out. I've certainly noticed this in my own life. If I've had a sin that I've been hiding, and then for whatever reason it just has to come to the surface, there's actually a huge amount of relief. As much as there's sort of shame and kind of, oh, I wish I hadn't done that, there's also a real relief. At last it's out in the open, because now it can be dealt with. And I've been saying this in the last couple of talks, that the power of the good news of Jesus Christ is at least in our ability to be able to face truth and face it with that sense of relief, because once the secret's known, it's no longer a secret. It no longer has the same amount of power in our lives to control our life. And so I think that that's not happening enough in our churches. We talk too generally. We use the gospel as a sort of a general term, and we're not getting to specifics, and we're not really kind of naming specific sins in our own communities, in our own hearts, and therefore and staying high and trying to keep things general. And we think, I suppose, that if we keep say things in general terms, it'll catch more people. But the reality is, the more specific you name the sin, the more you'll find more people relating, because specific sins are things that we do. We don't commit general sins. And when we name them, and when we describe them, and when we own them, we have a chance to own them at that point. We also have a chance to invite change. So we need to be provoked. We need to use the gospel, that word, in specific terms, spelling out specifically, clearly, concretely what it asks of us, what it calls us to, what it invites us into, so that we know where to go with it and how to respond to that and how to grow in it. And it will include, of course, naming of specific ways we've fallen and not lived up to that calling. I'm frustrated with the use of the gospel, or the word gospel, because it's too general. It's been used lazily, and it's time we got back to really looking at how we are to live, willing and allowing ourselves to be examined by this incredible good news that Jesus Christ has saved us, freed us. Now, in what ways is that true, and in what ways is that not in our lives? Anyway, those are my thoughts. My name is Philip, and I'm a sinner. And if you are, welcome to the club. And I pray that God's Spirit be with you, changing you into Christ. Amen.